Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our webinar this evening on the issue of redistricting of election maps and its impact on voting. This webinar is co-sponsored by the Center for Politics and the People at Ripon College and the League of Women Voters of the Ripon area. With the release of new census data in early August, state legislatures around the country are now redrawing election districts, which will be in place for the next 10 years. This has very important implications for the impact of voting and for control of both US Congress and state legislatures for the next decade. The country is seriously divided, however, right now, and stalemate in government often occurs both at the national and state levels on important policy issues, including the process of redistricting. David Daly, a senior fellow for Fair Vote, a nonpartisan organization favoring electoral reforms, has observed the following. There are really only about 36 truly competitive congressional seats right now. And partisans have realized in these polarized times that the best way to flip a district is to gerrymander it after the census. Eliminating competition has the effect of reducing the power of the vote, since only one candidate has the opportunity of winning in a gerrymandered district. And these districts are created with guaranteed lopsided majorities of only one party's supporters. Unfortunately, this is currently happening. And both Democrats and Republicans around the country are engaged in gerrymandering depending upon which party has the majority in state legislatures. In Oregon, where Democrats control the legislature and are in the process of redrawing election maps to favor their party even more, Republican State Assembly leader, Representative Christine Drayson, said in an interview in October with the Washington Post the following: politicians should not be drawing political boundaries, no matter who they are. We are getting more polarized by nature of these maps. How do we stop being broken if we're not willing to recognize that the process itself is broken? Our panelists tonight will discuss this impact of partisan politics in redistricting and its impact on the vote, whether there are nonpartisan methods to determine election maps, and the potential role of judicial courts in the process. So let me now introduce our panelists. Honorable Joan Ballweg is the state senator for the 14th Senate District located in central Wisconsin. Senator Ballweg previously agreed to join us this evening, but mid-morning today, her communications director emailed me that the senator is unable to attend. She sent some links to online materials from the Wisconsin Legislative Reference Bureau on how redistricting is done, which Senator Ballweg would have referred to in her presentation. A copy of this email message and the links for attendees to consult is available in the chat room below. Jordan Ellenberg is the John D. MacArthur Professor of Mathematics and Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor of Mathematics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His field is arithmetic algebraic geometry. His specific interests include rational points on varieties, asymptotic enumeration of number fields and other arithmetic objects, incidence problems, and algebraic methods in combinational geometry. His book, How Not to Be Wrong, was published in 2014. And his most recent book, published this May, is titled Shape: The Hidden Geometry of Information, Biology, Strategy, Democracy, and Everything Else. It explains the geometry behind gerrymandering. He disagrees with US Supreme Court decision Rucco versus Common Cause in 2019, wherein Chief Justice John Roberts ruled that there is no justiciable cause in gerrymandering involving a case in Wisconsin. In the book, Dr. Ellenberg argues that there is a standard geometrical method for judging whether election district maps are fair for all voters or not. Martin Farrell is Professor Emeritus of Politics and Government at Ripon College. The author of over 50 peer-reviewed works, he has led student and alumni study abroad experiences 8 times and has personally studied and done research in 45 countries on 5 continents. In terms of public service, Professor Farrell has served on the City of Ripon Police and Fire Commission, has represented the City of Ripon on the Fond du Lac County Board of Supervisors since 1994, and is currently in his 16th year as board chair. Ellen Sorensen, our moderator, is currently president of the League of Women Voters of the Ripon area and has served in a variety of roles both at the state and local league level over the past 10 years. She retired in 2020 as the coordinator of drug-free communities of Fond du Lac County, working to prevent substance use and abuse on an environmental level. Prior to that, she worked in county administration for 10 years as the Ripon Area Chamber of Commerce Executive Director. She currently owns and operates a women's boutique in downtown Ripon with her oldest son. So now Ellen will begin the conversation among the panelists for about 40 minutes, using several questions that the panelists agreed on ahead of time to guide their comments. We will then open the conversation for about 30 minutes or so to attendees, first using the questions submitted ahead of time by registered attendees, and then reading the new ones you attendees tonight who are present post in the chat room or Q&A box during the webinar. Please do post new questions and comments as the webinar proceeds, and we will answer them later. Ellen, Madam Moderator, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. We have 4 questions that had been approved by all 3 panelists. So we are going to go forward with those, and each respondent will have about 4 minutes to share their thoughts on it. We'll begin this first question with Jordan, and then we'll go back and forth. This is a very long question, and so I will try to be as brief as possible. Currently in Wisconsin, Democratic Governor Tony Evers wants redistricting commission he appointed to redraw new election maps due to some significant population changes since the last census in 2010. He has already filed a suit in federal court arguing the judicial system be prepared to redraw Wisconsin's electoral maps in the event of a stalemate between the governor and the legislature. The Republican-controlled legislature, however, has opposed Evers' lawsuit. They support using the state's current process of redistricting, where the legislature draws the maps and the governor approves them. They also propose a resolution that the new boundary lines should adhere to closely as possible to existing congressional and legislative district maps to promote equal opportunity to vote by minimizing disenfranchisement. Now, Wisconsin's not the only state that has split government. Republican governors with Democratic legislatures include Maryland, Massachusetts, and Vermont, and Democratic governors with Republican legislators in addition to Wisconsin include Michigan and Montana. So the question is, what are the implications of drawing electoral maps in split governments where one party controls the legislature and the other one the governorship? Is bipartisanship possible in such a divided political climate we are living in? Jordan, would you like to begin?
Sure. I mean, there's actually a lot of different questions embedded in that, but let me start, just by pushing back on one thing that was embedded in the question, which is the idea that our traditional system of redistricting is that the legislature passes a map and the governor approves it. No, the traditional system is that the legislature passes a map and the governor decides whether to approve it. And that's exactly what we're going to see happen. So in fact, what's been quite traditional in Wisconsin in eras of divided government, it's a good old fashioned Wisconsin tradition that I think is what happened for quite a few decades in a row prior to 2011, where the legislature and the governor could not agree on a map, and it ended up getting drawn by the courts. And that process can be messy, it takes time, but I think it's a lot better than one side having the unilateral authority to draw the maps on its own. And I would say the same if Governor Evers were proposing to just draw maps on his own and enact them without the legislature's say so, which Governor Evers is not proposing, but that would be equally bad. I answered one of the questions that was embedded in your question. You asked, is there a bipartisan way to do this? Yeah, I think so. And I think that sort of punting it to the courts, as we did in 2001 and as we've done in the past, is one reasonably bipartisan. Maybe it's bipartisaner than what we saw in 2011, where one party did the whole thing. And by the way, when I say one party did the whole thing, let me emphasize, because this is a long story and it's 10 years old and y'all may not remember it. I don't mean to say legislators from one party drew it. I mean literally folks who were not legislators, who were employees, or rather I should say consultants paid by the Republican Party, drew that map in a locked room in strict sequencing. So when I say the map was drawn by the party, that is what I mean, not that it was drawn by elected legislators who happen to be members of the party.
Okay, great. Marty?
Well, thank you. And thanks to the Center for Politics and the People for sponsoring what I hope is a useful session and certainly a very important topic. Now, again, yeah, you asked a lot of questions, but let me address a couple. Is it possible to have bipartisan maps drawn up? And obviously the answer is yes. So a number of states have decided that they will, at least, again, it's complicated and it's not all the same in every state, but quite a few of them have put the drawing of the lines, the district lines, in the hands of an independent commission. Sometimes it's retired judges, sometimes it's other people that have knowledge in this particular area. Iowa does it this way. And frankly, if you look at Iowa's congressional districts, you'll see that on the map now, they only have 4, but there's nice 4 pretty regular geometric shapes in Iowa, and they're very competitive. They've turned over a lot just in the last 6 or 8 years. I know at least one of the people involved personally, and we have talked about it. So you can do it in a way that is not skewed toward one party or the other. As a political scientist, I deplore partisan gerrymandering, just as I would deplore racial gerrymandering, which has been ruled unconstitutional, except in a handful of cases in which minorities need to be sure to be able to get at least some representation. And it's such as the 4th District of Illinois that is drawn up and doesn't look real nice on the map, but it's designed to make sure they have at least one Hispanic member of the congressional delegation. And that has been ruled to be all right within, certain limits. We have other countries that have single member districts. Many liberal democracies use proportional representation, which I think there's a lot to be said for, but that would not be legal in the United States right now. But United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, they all have single member districts. And in every single case, the district lines are not drawn up by the parliament. The parliament has nothing to do with it. It's drawn up by an independent commission. So the way we're doing it right now, and frankly, poisoning the well with extremely partisan approaches, whether it's Republican or Democrat, doesn't matter to me, is not inevitable, and it is not desirable, and it is not fair.
Thank you, Marty.
Can I add one
Yes,
thing? Because I don't think I used my whole 4 minutes. Because it's clear that Marty and I agree that a bipartisan process is possible. I just do want to say something I found striking and startling in the hearing on SB 621 that took place in the state house and in the Capitol last week was, Representative Voss really came out and said that he does not think that's possible. He said there's no such thing as a bipartisan process, he said, because somebody's got to draw the lines and people vote, and if you vote, you're partisan. Well, I have to say, I find that a very unfortunate view of how politics work. The idea that any one of us who lives and votes in Wisconsin is the same thing because we vote as a paid actor for a political party, that we would find it as voters impossible to look beyond our narrow partisan interests and think about what makes sense for the state. Boy, if that's your view of how people work, that to me is pretty sad. And I would like to think that as Wisconsin voters, any one of us, if we were involved in this process, would have the capability, not that we're perfect, right? Not that everybody has implicit biases, but that we would basically be able to put the interest of the state first. I think I could do that. I think everybody who's listening to this could do that. And I'm kind of sad that Representative Voss doesn't think we could do that.
Okay, we're going to move on to the second question. Marty, you're going to do the first answer on this, and then we'll move to Jordan. And thanks for your response on that, Jordan. When one party controls both the legislative and executive offices in a state, is this likely to produce redistricting with a partisan political effect, or are there mechanisms to prevent this? I did a little research, and the governor of New York State just signed a bill to ban gerrymandering, and that was passed. It's being done. Illinois just secured further gerrymandering in its state, and Alabama is maintaining its redistricting process since 2011. So, Marty, do you think that it's likely that folks can produce redistricting with that has to have a political effect, or are there mechanisms to prevent that?
There are possible ways for the people of a state to institute mechanisms against it. And I think, again, it's hard to be expert in all 50 states, but I believe, for instance, Florida, they actually got on the ballot a constitutional amendment prohibiting that. And I believe they also have either a bipartisan or nonpartisan commission set up. So, but that's really the only way. Only if the state itself has adopted something to prevent it, either legislation establishing an independent commission or a constitutional amendment. Because the federal government, in the case that Brian already alluded to, Rucho versus Common Cause, and the League of Women Voters was also involved there. Maybe this isn't the time right at the moment, but I can go into a lot of the legal arguments. But essentially, it's similar to the ruling in the Wisconsin case that made it to the Supreme Court, Gill versus Whitford. And basically, what Chief Justice Roberts argued in refusing to overturn partisan gerrymandered maps, basically he said, yeah, partisan gerrymandering can be bad. Some of it is probably baked into the cake as long as legislators are involved in drawing the maps. But when it comes to the Baker versus Carr, one person, one vote rulings of the 1960s, there is a much clearer standard in his view. So in other words, we can look at the population of a district, and if it's 10 times that of another district and they each have one representative, that's pretty clearly out of whack and underrepresents. And that's what was the case in many states before the Baker versus Carr and Reynolds versus Sims and those one person, one vote rulings. But what Roberts is saying, with a 5-4 majority right now, and this was actually before Justice Barrett joined the court. This is when Justice Ginsburg was still alive and voting. It was 5-4. The majority said that we don't have any such clear-cut mechanism for determining how much partisan gerrymandering is okay, but how much goes too far. We just don't have a way to measure that. So we're going to leave that to the legislative branches. And by the way, he did point out, and this is true, that Congress could end at any time, because Article 1, Section 4 clearly gives Congress, it says Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations that the states have adopted regarding elections, except as to the places of choosing senators. And that last part is because, of course, originally the US Senate was selected by the state legislatures. So that article says Congress can pass laws changing anything else, the way the states run the elections. And at times, back in the 19th century, before 1920, I know my time is up, just give me one more sentence with a couple semicolons. I do reserve the right for that. I had the dates written down here, but at several times in the 19th century, the Congress actually did outlaw partisan gerrymandering. But since 1920, the only federal rule on these things, other than the one person, one vote, and also racial discrimination prohibitions, is that they be single member districts. So Congress could fix this.
Thank you, Marty. Jordan?
Yeah, so can this be stopped? And there's a lot, and obviously, first of all, there are a lot of states where a lot of reform has been done through various mechanisms, through ballot initiatives. We don't have ballot initiatives unless initiated by the legislature in this state. Sometimes state Supreme Courts have, as in Pennsylvania, have seen their way into throwing out state maps that are partisan gerrymandered. Now, you know what, this Rucho case is a very interesting one, and I am not a lawyer. I'm not going to pretend to be one. So, you know, Brian, you led off saying I disagreed with the ruling. Well, I disagree with some of their findings of fact. As a matter of law, I'm not going to try to weigh in. But it's very important that people really know what the Supreme Court said. I'm going to reiterate it. The decision, Justice Roberts' decision, described the practice of partisan gerrymandering as incompatible with democratic principles. But he said, the court is powerless to weigh in. They found the matter injusticiable, which basically is like legal for punting, right? They're like, we can't make this play. Like, we don't have the power, they said, to intervene. So, you know, do remember, because you're going to hear a lot of politicians say, well, the Supreme Court said this was okay. What the Supreme Court said was, this is incompatible with democratic principles, but we can't stop you from doing it. So please understand when you hear people say this, and what they're saying is, we were told that we can't be stopped by the federal courts from doing this undemocratic thing. That is true. That is indeed the content of the ruling, but let's call it what it is, rather than a license or an endorsement of the practice. You know, what the Supreme Court said is that this is fundamentally a political matter. So you could say that what option did the Supreme Court offer the people of Wisconsin to combat partisan gerrymandering? They said, hey, if the people of the state want this not to happen, you can elect a governor of the other party. Well, we did that. And now what you see is the state legislature saying, like, well, we don't think that should count. The very mechanism that the Supreme Court said was the right breaking mechanism for gerrymandering, the whole people of the state all together can elect a governor of the other party to block that gerrymandered map and throw it to the courts. The state legislature is of the position that the people of the state should not have that political power. That, contrary to what the Supreme Court said, it's not a political question. It should be a question that is entirely in their hands. Sorry if that's a little heated, but I think that's the way I see it. I don't want to make it sound like I haven't seen your finger yet, so I think I've still got a minute. I don't want to make it sound too hopeless, because first of all, I do think, maybe I'm being optimistic, but I do think this is going to end up in the courts, and I do think we're going to end up with a map in this state that is better than the one we've had for the last 10 years. It would be a huge upending of all of Wisconsin history if we just decided that, unlike any other act passed by the legislature, this one is impervious to the governor's veto, and the courts can just say, like, it's what the legislature said. I would be surprised if that step were really taken. So yeah, I mean, I think one thing that we can do is, if you think the politics of the legislature are dirty, you can elect a governor who will oppose those politics. I would also say, ready for me to say something really corny? I mean, we're lucky to have, you know, Brian leading us, who is a professor of religion with a PhD in political science, because right here we do have an intersection of what is politically possible and what is good, right? When we talk about things like fairness, we are talking about moral and ethical questions. And, you know, it may be out of fashion to think that politicians can be swayed by moral and ethical concerns, but I don't think that's that crazy. I think people who know what this practice is don't like it. And I honestly think that a lot of elected officials probably don't like doing it.
You could elect me governor. Sheldon.
And I'm going to apologize because I'm home alone with two fierce attack dogs, all 9 pounds and 13 pounds of them. So you may hear barking. Jordan, we're going to have you lead off this next question. Is there a method of drawing electoral district maps that will maximize fairness and protect constitutionality guaranteed rights for all voters equally? If so, what would such a method entail, and what are the political conditions necessary for its acceptance?
No, the answer is no. But that's okay, because I don't believe in maximizing fairness. I mean, I'm a mathematician, not a politician or a philosopher or a lawyer. So I've studied this problem a lot from a mathematical point of view. And the conclusion that I've come to is there's no definition of perfectly fair. There's no answer to what is the best map that maximizes fairness. But that doesn't mean that we can't detect unfairness. That's a different and much easier problem. So, the way I see the problem facing us as analysts is not to sort of find a way to draw the perfectly fair map, but to identify the really egregious offenders, the worst of the worst. And guess what? We have one right here in Wisconsin. Look, there are a lot of maps out there in this country that are, it's kind of tilted towards this party, tilted towards that party, tilted towards protecting this incumbent, whatever. That happens. And I think that is a practice that we don't have to rigorously stamp out. I think what's important is to identify the absolute most extreme offenders, of which Wisconsin's assembly map, which is the one that I've studied the most, is definitely one. The way I see it is this: like if you have like a kid and you got Girl Scout cookies in your house, if your kid takes a cookie after dinner, you can just let the kid take a cookie after dinner. If you find that your kid is like eating the whole box every time, then you got to have rules, right? If your kid's just taking one cookie, you don't have to have a rule. You don't have to have like a rigid system. But you do want to say, like, okay, you take a cookie, maybe you took 2 because you had a bad day at school. Like, we're not going to make a thing of it. If the whole box is gone, okay, like that's an extreme, and that's easily detectable, right? It's not subtle. And what we have here in Wisconsin is by no means subtle.
Thank you, Marty.
Yeah, again, I have to agree with that. But as far as, again, I am going to use an example from my own experience here, and that's with the Fond du Lac County Board. And just last night, we approved our new districts based on the 2020 census data. We didn't have nearly as much time as we were supposed to because the census data was so late, but thanks to Terry Dietzel and his excellent staff, they really expedited the process. And so we were able to do it last night, November 2nd, and that gives time to advertise the new districts and people to take out papers to run starting December 1st. So we're in good shape. But frankly, we did no partisan monkeying with it or incumbent protection or anything like that. We got the block level census data. Finally, our planning department took that information. They used a state website or software called WiseLR. And this is provided by the state of Wisconsin to help them draw lines. And we said, okay, what criteria? Obviously, relatively within a few percentage points, equal population is most important. Having a coherent shape is important. Respecting municipal boundaries when possible is important. Trying to find minority representation if possible, that's important because we haven't had that much, and our population is getting more diverse. So, based on all these things, we finally said incumbent protection is not something we want. So we don't even want you to look at the addresses of the current supervisors. So they went out and drew up those maps. They brought them back. Yep, we have at least 2 supervisors in one district now that are going to have to run against each other or one step down. But we made a couple of minor adjustments just because of neighborhoods that we wanted to keep together. And also in the city of Waupun, we had to make an adjustment to keep, they consolidated some wards. So that was our process. And I know that sounds boring, but it was approved unanimously by the committee. It was then passed unanimously by the board, even by the 2 representatives that are going to have to run against each other, because they recognized it was fair. So it can be done, and it is being done, but you have to have people who believe in fairness and in majority rule, not minority rule.
But the good thing is, Alan, that because the system we have here in Wisconsin is so structurally bad and so ripe for abuse, you almost couldn't do worse. Almost any way you changed it would give you a better system. So that's my optimistic take. It's like the TV, you kick it and it's already broken. So if you kick it, maybe it'll turn on. You can't make it any worse.
We're going to do our 4th and final determined questions, but this one's I'm going to give a little example of the Iowa model for folks who don't know what that is. I also want to let folks know that the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin has had a position on redistricting since the 1970s. We have had a 50-year position on it. And one of the issues that we talk about a lot is that something like the Iowa model. It's fair, it's nonpartisan. The Iowa model offers the duty of drawing both legislative and congressional district line. It falls to the state's Legislative Service Agency, or their LSA. To assist in fulfilling this duty, Iowa Code calls for the creation each decade of a temporary redistricting advisory commission, which provides guidance and advice to the LSA on certain redistricting matters when requested. Iowa's redistricting process is widely considered a national model and has several safeguards intended to limit partisan influence over the map drawing process. But the state's redistricting criteria can sometimes be at odds with each other and lead to irregular looking shapes. They've just submitted their second map to the legislature for approval. Iowa's nonpartisan redistricting process requires districts to be of roughly equal population size. They also have to be contiguous and compact and cannot split counties. The Legislative Services Agency cannot take into account any demographic information aside from population when drawing the state's districts. So the question, our final question, and we're going to start this one with Marty. Should the courts determine electoral maps when there is a stalemate between governors and legislatures on what constitutes the fairest outcome for all voters, such as the Iowa model?
The Iowa model, I think, is a good one, and I think it has worked pretty well for them. Yeah, certainly, I agree. Jordan has said no system is perfect, and that is true. But some are much worse than others. And yeah, what they did in Wisconsin back after the 2010 census was pretty bad. Also, what they did and I know that Democrats in Illinois have put forward a map that looks pretty bad. I haven't had time to study it carefully yet, but it looks like tit for tat. They're saying if Wisconsin's going to do it, we'll do it too. That's the real problem. And that's the problem with Justice Roberts and the majority opinion in the courts, that the solution is political. Well, so yeah, you can elect a governor that will veto the maps. Yes, okay. But I certainly can't change it politically by changing the legislators, because the deck is stacked. That's the whole point of the gerrymandering, is to stack the deck and keep the people in power, to entrench them in power. So that's a catch-22 from that great book from a few decades ago. But in practice, what is going to happen is, as you said, in a divided state like Wisconsin, and with no commission, no oversight, presumably the legislature will put forward some maps. The governor will veto them. Maybe they'll talk. Maybe they'll try to compromise. The governor has what he called a People's Map Commission. I've looked over their maps. They look good to me. They'd be pretty different. Let me give you an example from the Evers Commission maps that they have submitted. Right now, Ripon is in the 14th district with no other cities other than like Baraboo and Portage, also small cities. The new maps put forward by the Evers Commission, Ripon would be in the 13th district, which would have not only Ripon, but also Fond du Lac and Oshkosh. That would be rather different, wouldn't it? And probably a different outcome. So this can make a really big difference. But as a practical matter right now, if it's not impossible that they could possibly compromise, but it's hard to see that happening. So then, yep, it does end up in the courts. And what courts? If it's the state courts and goes to the state Supreme Court, you probably get a ruling favoring the legislators' maps. But then that would be challenged in the federal courts, and there you might get a different outcome. And if it goes all the way to the US Supreme Court again, well, we know what their stand is. I guess they would defer to the legislature. So that's some of the possibilities with how it could play out.
Yeah, I mean, to your question, I think, yes, I think that it's, again, this is the way we've done it in Wisconsin. And we've done it in many times. The map I'm most familiar with, the one that came into being in 2001 for the 2002 elections. I think that map was fine. Was it perfect? Probably not. Map can't be perfect. But that map that was essentially drawn up by the court after the legislature and the governor could not agree. In fact, after that, each party submitted tons of maps to the court, and the court rejected them all. The court was like, come on, these maps, like every one of these maps, everyone submitted by the Democrats is like blatantly Democrat favoring. Everyone submitted by the Republicans is blatantly Republican favoring. We're gonna have to do this ourselves. And they did it, and they did it fine. Because like basically anybody who has this job to do, if they're not explicitly partisan actors, they're gonna do a better job than the map that we're getting right now. I don't care who it is. I don't care if it's retired judges or an active court or people taken out of the telephone book, they would do a better job. I truly do believe that. That said, I think, I tend, and I think most of us tend to see judges as people who are at least aspire to be above the partisan fray. But of course, you have this point of view I alluded to before, Representative Voss's point of view that everybody's a partisan, everybody's in hawk. There's no such thing as like putting the interests of the state or just the plain truth like ahead of your partisan interest. I think for some people, that's their vision of the judiciary, which I think is also pretty sad. I didn't grow up in states where we elected judges. And I will say that I find it, I don't know how you guys feel. You guys have lived in Wisconsin longer than I have. I've been here 15 years. I do find it troubling that by now, a judicial election, while formally nonpartisan, everybody knows which judge Democrats are supporting, and everybody knows which judge Republicans are supporting, and it has become another kind of partisan election. And that to me feels dangerous if we think of the courts as the last nonpartisan actors standing. And I'm wondering, for those of you who have been in Wisconsin politics for a lot longer than me, do you feel like it used to be that way, or do you feel like that's a change? Am I allowed to ask questions, Ellen? Sorry.
It's a change.
And it's bad, right?
Yeah. It's bad. It is.
Everything is becoming weaponized, and it's really all about power above principle. Principle doesn't seem to mean much anymore. It's all about what maximizes my tribe's power. And whatever that takes, and if we're looking at something nationally now, that we are seeing people who are willing to destroy America's democratic system, small d, in order to try to gain power and enhance and entrench their power. So the power over principle is fundamentally what is driving this. And I guess at our county level, we have people that aren't that power hungry, and frankly, the stakes probably aren't that high. And so we're able to hand it over to our staff and say, follow the kinds of principles that Ellen was just mentioning. And if you do that correctly, we will approve it. And that's what we have done. But I guess there's some people believe that they will be destroyed if they don't maintain their power. And so there's no adherence to principle anymore.
Well, it's an issue of fairness or lack thereof. And going back to the Supreme Court decision at the state or at the national conference, we had the lawyers who did argue the gerrymandering case in front of the Supreme Court. And they did indicate that one of the reasons the Supreme Court kicked it back was that the gentleman who had initially brought the suit didn't have standing. So he lived in an area in which his vote counted. Now, in our area, many times our votes don't count, and that gives us standing. And it's disturbing to know when you go to the polls, because of the way we've done redistricting, that your vote doesn't count. But we're going to move on to some of the questions that our pre-registrants had sent along. And I think, Brian, you're going to ask a question.
Yes, before I do so, since Jordan outed me as a crypto ethicist, I want to remind him that there's an old adage in ethics: when you can't get the best, the moral thing is to choose the least evil. And I think, Jordan, you've pointed out tonight that there are many least evils that could be selected that would be better than where we are now. So hopefully something like that will happen. Also, Marty, you seem to imply something that is attributed to Machiavelli, namely that politics is just a pursuit of power. But in The Prince, Machiavelli says the prince has to be careful in exercising that power, because if he goes too far or she goes too far, you're going to get a revolution by the people. And so don't anger an incredible number of people. And I think if this gerrymandering continues to occur, both by the Democrats and the Republicans around the country, there is very possible a groundswell of opposition that could occur. So I just wanted to put that on the table. Now, the questions. Several of our attendees tonight who pre-registered submitted some questions. So Ellen and I are going to choose 4 of them to read to you, and then the panelists can respond, and then we will look at the chat box where we have more questions. Here is a question from a Ripon College alum of 2012, Bryant Vanderkolk. And he says this: I live in Maryland, where Democrats will redraw the congressional districts and may give themselves a leg up in congressional representation. But I grew up in Wisconsin, where you know that Republicans will have a chance to maintain their electoral advantage in Congress. Consider something akin to the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. Let me repeat that: the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. The agreement that states award all their electoral votes to whichever presidential candidate wins the overall popular vote, provided enough states buy into the deal. And so Brian asks, how successful do you panelists think a similar interstate bipartisan compact to set up independent redistricting commissions like Arizona's or California's would be? For example, Maryland and Wisconsin, both of whom have 8 congressional districts, could make a compact that they would allow for independent commissions to redraw their districts, provided the other does the same. Could this be one way out of this hyper-precise partisan gerrymandering situation? So Marty and Jordan, what do you think about that? And Ellen as well.
Well, if I can go first, it's worth a try. And I understand also the initiative with regard to the Electoral College, because after all, we've now had 2 out of our last, 5 presidential elections in which the Electoral College winner did not win the popular vote. And that's, now maybe some people don't think that's a problem, but again, if you believe in majority rule, I think you have to see that rather than minority rule, which is the alternative. You have to see that as a problem. This plan has equivalents at the congressional level. In other words, I think he's suggesting that because they each have 8 seats, there'd be balance there. If Democrats have an edge through gerrymandering congressional districts in Maryland and Republicans have them in Wisconsin, maybe they'd be willing to say, okay, if it'll be a neutral outcome if we both agree to that. And I think that would be a great idea. That's the first time I've heard that proposal. And I would like to see somebody actually put that forward. I'm just afraid, though, that then you have the state legislative level, and that's where people both there and here are probably not willing to risk giving up power if they can possibly help it.
Yeah, I think this point that Marty makes is exactly right, that it does involve people willingly giving up power that they have. And that is a hard sell for elected officials. Like, why do they choose the business that they're in? Oh, no offense, Marty, I forgot you are an elected official. Okay, so why do many choose the business that they're in order to hold that power? And I think, for someone who's in a legislative majority in Wisconsin, in the state legislature, I don't think the prospect of giving up some of that power so that some Democratic state representative in Maryland has less power too is a very appealing process, right? I don't think Robin Voss is going to bite on that. I think it probably works better at the congressional level. But I mean, I think, one thing I think that I find, and I'm curious if you guys will agree, is that this distinction between the state legislative lines and the congressional lines is really important, because the congressional lines, they do, to an extent, not fully, but to an extent, balance each other out, right? You have the Illinois Democrats and Maryland Democrats playing dirty and Wisconsin Republicans playing dirty. And at least there's some amount of cancellation. You don't have what you have in the state legislative boundary, where it's really like just the one party that's in the majority of the one state drawing the entire map. It would be as if like a Democrat, if the Democratic majority in the House of Representatives could by themselves draw the entire US House of Representative maps. Imagine how insanely gerrymandered it would be. I think we all agree that would be a lot worse than the patchwork system of gerrymandering bipartisanship that we have now. But that horrible outcome is what we have at the state legislative level. And I think people are not quite paying enough attention to that, because, on the national political level, Washington Post is not going to write about our assembly, right? They're going to write about who's going to be our representatives in Congress who would come to Washington, D.C.
All right, I'm going to move on to the second question from a professor at Ripon College. The redistricting of 2011 resulted in a Republican majority in the state legislature that does not correspond with the results of statewide elections, President and U.S. Senate. The proposed maps for 2021 are reported to be similar to the 2011 maps. The first explanation that comes to mind for me is state legislative maps represent an extreme partisan gerrymander that inappropriately favors Republican candidates. If there is another explanation, I would be interested in hearing it. Any takers?
Too bad Senator Ballweg didn't come. I think she had the explanation, but she had the proposed alternative, but no. No, that's what it is. No, I mean, shall I channel Robin Voss again? I mean, I know what he would say, so can I be him? I mean, he would say like, well, we're just trying to make it easier for the voters. Like, people don't like changing their district. Like, we're just trying to create minimal disruption. Well, of course, this map that was enacted in 2011 created massive disruption. So, and you know, Representative Voss knows that. He knows that we know it, but he's got to say something, right? But the explanation is exactly the one that you say it is. And I think there's only the thinnest fig leaf pretending that it's anything other than that.
Yes, I'll just add a little bit. I have looked at the new maps of the Republican proposal, and they actually would pit 6 of their assembly members against each other in the 15th, 82nd, and 93rd assembly districts, but none in the Senate. So I don't know, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to sacrifice at least 3, because I don't know what they're doing exactly in the neighboring districts. But that's the only change, and none in the Senate. And if you go back to 2018, as the questioner mentioned, I'm sorry, I'm looking off screen at a table here. In 2018, statewide, the Democrats won 53% of the assembly votes, and 53%, and got 36.4% of the seats. Now, I understand, and Jordan could maybe speak to this as well if we have time, but there is some self-sorting, going on. And Craig Gilbert, who has been on other panels that you have sponsored, has written about this, and I recommend reading his work because it's very good and he knows what he's talking about. The rural districts in Wisconsin are getting redder all the time, and they didn't used to be quite that Republican, 10, 15 or more years ago. So that means Democrats are packed into urban areas that are not going to have as many districts. Just they may start, they may win districts in Madison with 80-90% of the vote, which does give them a higher overall percentage of the vote, but only wins those seats. But still, the margin is way beyond what is there geographically. And in fact, I have seen studies by very well-known political scientists who said that the Republican districts that they have had in place the past decade could happen by chance only one time out of 60,000. In other words, run 60,000 iterations of possible results, and you get what they come up with exactly once out of 60,000 times. So the questioner is right, and they're doing their best to continue it.
We have another question from 2 alums, Bob Brennan in the class of 73, Catherine Schultz in the class of 89, and they've both asked questions about the role of courts, which we've touched upon tonight. Bob asked, is there any chance the redistricting will not wind up in the courts, state or federal? I think the panelists have kind of implied that it will.
This much chance.
Pardon?
This much chance.
That much chance. What legal challenges, especially, this is Catherine Schultz's question, what legal challenges, especially given the Wisconsin Supreme Court's partisan activism, do redistricting efforts face in Wisconsin? What can a citizen, as well as those charged with withdrawing the district lines, do to minimize such challenges? I think, Jordan, to spell out what you said before, or Marty, if it eventually goes into the federal courts and goes up the system, even if the district court and the appellate court say that the map in Wisconsin drawn by the legislature is unfair, the Supreme Court could just use its precedent from its cases in 2019 and say there's no way to decide this, and stop the whole process and send it back to the legislature. Is that right, Marty?
Well, they that could happen, but again, any maps my understanding, any maps approved by the legislature are subject to gubernatorial veto. So the bottom line is at some point you have to have maps. And so a court, either state or federal, could say, okay, legislature presented maps, governor vetoed them. That means right now there's no maps, but we've got to have maps. So we'll draw the map. And the court itself can draw the maps. And this is now a challenge, I suppose. This would be a real problem. And I suppose this could be like we used to have in basketball before in the second shot clock in college basketball. You had the four-corner offense like Smith at North Carolina.
Okay, Marty, I think your volume is fading out, so we'll come back to you in a minute. Ellen, you have another question?
I do. This was from a community member, and Cal is also a league member. If people operate under a system of morals, I'm going to make sure I'm not muted. If people operate under a system of morals, the concept of fair maps being the right thing to do, and ethics, the actual process of doing what you think is correct, redistricting, how would you answer the question of what you do think of redistricting? The point being, are fair maps and redistricting the same?
I mean, I guess what I'd say, I mean, I do think it's important to always remember the moral dimension of this question. You know, I think for somebody like me, who's a mathematician, it's very easy to think about it purely analytically and say, I sort of want to reduce this to a numerical computation. But we're talking about real people, right? Not numbers on a spreadsheet. So I do think that ethical dimension is there. Do I think fair maps and redistricting are the same? No, I think redistricting is a value neutral term and fair maps is not. I think there's more fair and less fair ways to redistrict, and we've seen both.
Artie?
Okay, sorry, I was cut off there for a few minutes, a minute or so. Could you just give me the gist of the question again, please?
Well, it's basically a moral question about the concept of fair maps being the right thing to do, and ethics, the actual process of doing what you think is correct in redistricting. The point being, are fair maps and redistricting the same?
Well, I from a political science viewpoint, we don't like the distortion of the popular will that is involved in the gerrymandering. So, you know, again, if we go to John Locke, we have government by consent of the people, and the people express themselves through majority votes. Now, there are basic rights that even the majority cannot take away or interfere with, and that's life, liberty, and property, or the pursuit of happiness that was put in our founding document. But the problem with the moral problem that I have with gerrymandering is that it is a violation of the basic principle of majority rule. And yes, I do think that's immoral.
Okay, I think it might be time, Brian, if you want to choose a question from the folks who have been submitting them in chat.
The attendees, you've been very patient and you've submitted some wonderful questions. And in the chat room, we have a question from Andrea Young, who is the Vice President for Finance at Ripon College and also a member of our mathematics department. And Jordan, she has a question for you. And the question is the following. How is, or to what extent is your work and that of other mathematicians related to quantifying fairness of districts and legislative maps being used in the post-2020 census?
Yeah, well, that is the thing I've thought about a lot. And I want to emphasize, by the way, that it's not my work. I write a lot about this stuff, but I'm a popularizer. I mean, my math research work is in other areas, but I've learned a lot about what folks like Moon Duchin and at Tufts and Justin Solomon at MIT and Jonathan Mattingly at Duke and Wes Pegden at Carnegie Mellon. I mean, there's a whole group of people who are working on this. And what is great about these mathematical methods, essentially what they do is they figured out how to get a computer to generate thousands upon thousands, even now millions actually, of legally compliant maps, kind of from like alternate universes, the maps that we could be using to see what they look like, to use as a benchmark to which we can compare the maps that are proposed by the legislature or any other actor or the People's Commission or whoever. What's great about that is it enables us to answer questions that previously were just stuff we had to like argue about on Facebook, but there was no real data about. So for instance, this question that Marty raised of like, well, maybe the Republicans just have an advantage because, in my assembly district is 80%, 77 here in Madison is 80% Democratic. The Democrats all like to like huddle together in Madison, and maybe that's why, maybe that explains it. And using these methods, you can figure out exactly how much Republican advantage comes from that geographic clustering phenomenon. It is real thing, and it means that under our current single district system, which, by the way, there's we could talk about alternatives to that system, but in the system we have, in a political environment that was not in that particular year tilting towards the Democrats or towards the Republicans, in which the popular vote is relatively equal between the two, you probably would have a Republican majority in the assembly, and it would probably be, I don't know, 53, 54 seats, but a majority. You have a majority, you can get stuff done. But it wouldn't be the kind of titanic, close to veto-proof majority that we actually see. That's a product of the gerrymander. And what's cool about the mathematical methods is it really just enables us to answer questions like that. And those answers are at this point not controversial. People do it a lot of different ways, and you always get the same answer.
And could I just quickly add something there? Nate Silver's 538 website has something that your viewers and participants may wish to look at. It's called the Atlas of Redistricting. Atlas of Redistricting. So if you want to look that up, they take every congressional district in the country, obviously at every state, and they show you, I believe, 8 or 9 different ways to draw the district lines. And you can make them the most Democrat leaning that you could possibly do, the most Republican, the most representative, the most competitive, the best reflection of the population within the district, each district within each state. You can do all the alternatives just with a push of the button. And I found it very interesting. And that shows you the variety of options that are available, and you can actually execute them yourselves.
Thank you. Moving on to another question, and I actually would like to answer this question first before you two have at it. It's from Tim Blake. Should a redistricting commission be nonpartisan or bipartisan? And for 30 years that I've been involved in League, we have always looked at the Iowa model, which is a nonpartisan commission, and they are retired judges. So that is a model that I tend to think of as less raucous when you have nonpartisan. So Jordan or Marty, who would like to comment?
100% it should be nonpartisan, or as nonpartisan as possible. Because you see what just happened to Virginia, where they had a bipartisan commission, and if it's perceived that a stalemate and a failure of the commission will benefit one party, and if the commission is made up of exactly half partisan actors from one party and exactly half partisan actors from other party, the party that stands to benefit from the failure will make the commission fail. Which, if it's 50-50, it can do it. If it's not 50-50, then it's not a bipartisan commission, right? If you have like 100 partisan actors versus 99 partisan actors, you might as well have 199 partisan actors from the same party. So, there are, 99.99% of people in this state and in this country don't work for a political party and don't wake up in the morning being like, how can I advance Democratic sway or Republican sway over the levers of power of this country, right? That is not a way that normal people think of the world. It's the way that Robin Voss thinks of the world. Well, it's his job. Like, I accept it. But it's not the way normal Wisconsinites think of the world, and normal Wisconsinites could do a better job with this process. They may vote Democrat, they may vote Republican, but normal people are able to see past that.
Marty?
Yep, I would also say nonpartisan for exactly the same reason, because if it's partisan, you're going to have an equal number of each, I guess, or otherwise they're going to say it's unfair. And if you have an equal number of each, they'll just deadlock, and it's worthless. Our county board is nonpartisan. We don't run with a party affiliation. And, as a political scientist, I know the function of political parties in a functioning democratic system. But I think we're getting the point now where our democratic system is not functioning. It is dysfunctional. And Madison is extremely dysfunctional. So thank God at our county level, we have stayed away from that. And we do what's pragmatically best for the county. And we had no conflict at all over our redistricting. We set out the criteria that any good government manual will tell you should be the criteria, and our staff executed it and we approved it. We're done. And now the people can choose who they want for their county board supervisor, and we will go forward.
But I want to add on to that too, because once the county finishes its work, then the local municipal governments have to do their work also, like cities and villages and towns, correct, Marty?
Well, they have done that with regard to their wards. But yeah, wards aren't the same as electoral districts. Usually the electoral districts have several wards.
Yeah.
And wards don't have to be equal population. We have a lot of weird wards out there with no people or one person. So the wards have to be combined. And yeah, that's up to the municipality.
So while the county has finished its work, those municipalities then have to work on their wards within the context of the county government too.
They're electoral districts.
Right. Right.
Yeah, but again, we don't really have, those don't have to correspond to the county's districts. Just the wards do. So they can really they can have a completely at-large city council if they want. They don't even have to have districts. And a lot of the townships actually are like that. They don't have districts. So what the municipalities do right now is really independent of what the county has done. Okay.
I'm just concerned that people understand that this is not simply a congressional or a state issue. It is a local issue also. Brian, I think we may have time for one more question.
Yes, this is a follow-up question by Tim Like, and he is the former publisher of our local newspaper, the Ripon Commonwealth Press. And his question is, what had to happen in Iowa to cause the state government there to create a redistricting panel and get redistricting out of the hands of the legislature and governor? So Marty and Jordan and Ellen, Ellen, you brought up Iowa. That has been going on for years, what you described. What started it?
I can't, I hadn't gone back far enough because I started becoming familiar with it in the early 90s when I served on the state board. And so as a result, it's never occurred to me 20 years later for me to, or 30 years later, to look at what caused it. I would assume, and I shouldn't probably do that it was an issue of fairness.
Mm-hmm. We're long beyond that, are we not?
Historically, I'm not sure. I would have to check, but I think, as Jordan suggested earlier, usually when it's been taken out of the hands of the legislature, it's been a citizen initiative, either a constitutional amendment, which is brought up at the grassroots level, or other movements. It's usually not initiated by the legislators themselves. But as far as I would have to go look at the history of that in Iowa, because I did not research that for this evening.
An interesting case is that of Ohio, where now I think I understand this well, and other people say it. My understanding was that there was a threat of a ballot initiative that would have a lot more teeth, and the Ohio legislature did voluntarily impose some reforms, maybe not as much as one might like, but I think an improvement over what came before. But part of that is that, you know, in Ohio, you have John Kasich, who, you know, is quite a conservative Republican, but is also one of the most powerful voices opposing partisan gerrymandering. He's a guy who, maybe this is old fashioned in today's politics, but he wants to win fair and square. He certainly wants Republicans to control the state house in Ohio. There's no question about that. But he doesn't want them to win on a slanted playing field. He wants to go out and work for the votes. You guys think I'm being too nice to John Kasich? I don't know. I mean, he's come to court and he's like testified, you know, on what I consider to be the right side of this stuff. And so it can feel useless at times to like do this kind of incremental, constant public pressure, but I don't believe it's useless.
Ellen, there's one more question that our professor of economics, Soren Hauge, has submitted. You want to read that?
Sure. Mathematically, or in another way of thinking about geography, what is a useful way of thinking about what compactness means for local legislative districts?
So can I take this one? Because this is like kind of another mathy one.
You have to.
Okay.
You have to.
So it's interesting because historically, and even the name gerrymandering comes from these kind of salamander-shaped districts. And it comes from this idea that these districts would have to be very sinuous and strangely shaped in order to accomplish their absurd partisan goals. But the truth is that's no longer true. I mean, with computers, it's so easy to program the computer to get you districts that achieve your partisan goals and actually look pretty nice. And if you look at our assembly districts we have right now, they don't look crazy. They don't have like, they're not filled with like crazy tentacles and discontiguities and crazy shapes. They're, you know, a lot of them are just these innocent looking oblongs, but that are in fact gerrymandered as all hell. And so I would say we've kind of, I mean, compactness is still a traditional criterion. We still go for it because it is, you know, you do ideally want the legislator to physically be in close proximity to their constituents, which is what compactness is all about. But I think it's kind of become decoupled from gerrymandering. You can have a very gerrymandered map that has good compactness. You can have a very ungerrymandered map that has terrible compactness. I no longer, after studying a lot of these papers, I no longer think those two things are really related.
Okay.
Well, I think we're coming to the end of our time. I want to thank Ellen for your masterful job of keeping the conversation moving. And I always refer to you as the perfect moderator. You are the iron fist in the velvet glove. You didn't need to use it hard tonight. But Jordan, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. Madison and Marty, you teaching as well as your work for the county, we want to thank you. Do any of you have any final words of wisdom that you would like to leave with the audience tonight?
I think we said it all, right?
Do your best as a citizen to look beyond perhaps your own selfish or self-interested position and consider what really is best for the country. And fairness is the only way our system can continue to last as it has for the last 230 plus years. Thank you.
And despite what Robin Foss say, it is possible for people in Wisconsin and around the country to take that view, whatever partisan commitments they may have.
Well, thank you.
Some of us are nonpartisan.
Before we end, I'd like to let the attendees know and the panelists that a week from tonight, November 10th, the Center for Politics and the People will host internationally recognized disability advocate Judith Heumann. She will be part of a Zoom webinar at 6:30 p.m. Her talk is entitled Judy Heumann, Our Fight for Disability Rights. And registration for the webinar can be accessed at www.ripon.edu/rights. And I just put that in the chat right now for those of you who would like to register ahead of time. Her story was featured in the award-winning 2020 documentary Crip Cramp, A Disability Revolution. It's really worth seeing, and the documentary may be viewed for free on YouTube and on Netflix. Crip Camp, A Disability Revolution. So we hope you can all join us again next week for a very interesting conversation about disability rights by an internationally known advocate, Judith Heumann. So I thank the panelists. I thank Madam Chair. Thank all the attendees for attending tonight, and we hope to see you again in a week in our next webinar.
Thanks everybody for
Thank you.
coming.
Thanks, everybody. It will take a few minutes for people to exit. So I'm going to end the webinar.
Nice meeting you, Jordan. Thank you.
Yes, very nice.
Thanks,
Great to
Jordan.
meet you guys too. Thank you so much.
We love it when someone in pure science can make their knowledge and wisdom available for us who are sloshing around in the world of politics or ethics.
Well, it's been fun getting impure and learning about this stuff. So, all right, I'll see you guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.